Jessica, head of the Internal Affairs Division, had spent her day reviewing files and addressing systemic issues within the police department. It was a heavy but necessary role, one that demanded resilience and clarity. As she approached a quiet intersection, her path was interrupted by the sudden flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. The sharp wail of a siren followed, slicing through the calm evening air. Confused but composed, Jessica eased her vehicle to the side of the road. Her mind raced to determine what could have prompted the stop. She had been meticulous in her driving, her adherence to traffic laws second nature. Turning down the volume of the music, she waited, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The officer approached with a slow, deliberate stride. His silhouette was imposing against the backdrop of the flashing lights. Officer Daniel Hayes was known to assert his authority with a particular intensity, one that many had experienced as unnecessarily harsh. Tonight his demeanour carried the same unmistakable weight. Adjusting his belt and clearing his throat, he rapped twice on Jessica's window. Jessica rolled it down with deliberate calm. "Good evening, officer," she greeted, her voice even. Hayes peered at her, his gaze lingering a moment too long. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone clipped. "Of course," Jessica replied, reaching into the glove compartment with measured movements. As she handed him the documents, she asked, "May I know the reason for the stop?" Hayes's expression tightened. "You didn't come to a complete stop at the last intersection," he stated flatly. Jessica frowned slightly. "I'm certain I did," she said, her tone respectful but firm. "If there was a misunderstanding, I'd like to clarify." Hayes's lips curled into a smirk. "Clarify?" "That's interesting," he said, flipping through her documents without looking at her. "You're not from around here, are you?" Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly. "I live in this city. My address is on my license," she replied evenly. "An address is one thing," Hayes said, leaning against her door. "But it doesn't tell me why someone like you is driving a car like this in a neighborhood like this." The insinuation hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Jessica's composed exterior did not falter, though the sting of his words was sharp. "Someone like me?" she repeated, her tone calm but pointed. Hayes stepped back, gesturing vaguely. "You know what I mean," he said. "People who think they can bypass the rules because they look the part. Driving fancy cars, acting untouchable." Jessica felt her pulse quicken. She took a steadying breath, choosing her words carefully. "I assure you, officer, I am neither bypassing the rules nor acting untouchable. I'm simply driving home after a long day at work." Hayes's eyes narrowed, his hand resting conspicuously on his belt. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his voice low and commanding. Jessica hesitated. "May I ask why?" "Are you resisting a lawful order?" Hayes snapped, his voice rising. Understanding the potential danger of escalation, Jessica nodded slowly. "Not at all," she said, unbuckling her seatbelt. She opened the door and stepped out, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. Her posture remained poised, her head held high. "Hands on the hood," Hayes instructed, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Jessica complied, placing her hands on the cool surface of her SUV's hood. The scene felt surreal, the street eerily quiet except for the occasional hum of passing cars. Hayes began to pat her down, his movements methodical but lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. "You're clean," he muttered, stepping back. His frustration was evident, as though he had expected to uncover something incriminating. Jessica turned to face him, her gaze steady. "Officer Hayes," she began, her voice calm but laced with authority. "I believe this interaction has gone far beyond the bounds of a routine traffic stop. Your questions and actions suggest a deeper issue, one rooted in assumptions rather than facts." Hayes stiffened. "I'm just doing my job," he retorted. Jessica's expression didn't waver. If this is how you conduct routine stops, it's no wonder there are concerns about abuse of power within the department. Hayes's smirk faltered. And what would you know about that? He challenged. Jessica reached into her pocket, pulling out a sleek leather wallet. She opened it deliberately, revealing her badge. The gleam of the emblem caught the streetlight as she held it up. Jessica Brown, she stated, her voice steady and resolute. Chief of Internal Affairs. The colour drained from Hayes's face as the weight of her words sank in. The authority he had tried to wield over her now paled in comparison to the authority she held over him. For a moment, he was silent, his posture rigid, and his confidence shattered. Jessica lowered the badge but kept her gaze locked on him. We will be having a formal conversation about this incident, Officer Hayes, she said. I suggest you prepare. Without waiting for a response, she returned to her car, her movements precise and deliberate. As she drove away, Hayes remained rooted to the spot, the flashing lights of his cruiser casting a harsh glow on the reality of his actions. Jessica's heart was steady, her resolve unshaken. This encounter was more than personal. It was a reminder of the systemic change she was determined to lead. Jessica knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds of Jessica's office as she sat at her desk, the badge from the previous night resting beside a stack of files. Her computer screen displayed the department's internal database, with Officer Daniel Hayes's name highlighted prominently. She clicked into his record, her expression hardening as she scrolled through the documented complaints. There it was, a pattern of behaviour. Allegations of racial profiling, excessive force and misconduct had been filed against Hayes multiple times over the years. Each entry was accompanied by the same notation. Insufficient evidence? No further action taken? Jessica's jaw tightened. These weren't isolated incidents. They were signs of a deeper problem within the department's accountability structure. A knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called, her voice firm. Detective Marcus Reed entered, a folder tucked under his arm. Morning, Chief, he said, his tone cautious. I heard about the stop last night. You okay? Jessica offered a faint smile. I'm fine, Marcus, but Hayes won't be for long. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. What do you have for me? Reed handed her the folder. Background on Hayes. I pulled his performance reviews and spoke with a few officers who've worked with him. There's a lot of smoke, Chief. Enough to suggest there's fire. Jessica flipped through the folder, her eyes scanning the reports. Patterns of aggression, veiled hostility during interactions with minorities, and a reluctance to accept oversight were recurring themes. Thank you, Marcus, she said, closing the folder. This is exactly what I need. Schedule a meeting with the disciplinary board. It's time we address this head-on. Reed nodded. Will do. And Chief? He added, pausing at the door. Not everyone's going to be happy about this. You know how it is. Jessica's gaze was resolute. I didn't take this job to make friends, Marcus. I took it to make a difference. The day passed in a blur of preparations. Jessica's determination only grew as she reviewed policies and planned the steps needed to dismantle the culture of impunity that had allowed officers like Hayes to operate unchecked. By evening, she stood in the conference room, facing the disciplinary board. The board members, a mix of senior officers and civilian oversight representatives, listened intently as Jessica presented her case. She detailed the complaints against Hayes, supported by testimony and documentation. Her words were measured but impassioned, painting a picture of systemic failure and the urgent need for reform. This isn't just about Officer Hayes, Jessica concluded, her gaze sweeping across the room. This is about every officer who believes they're above accountability and every citizen who's lost faith in our department because of it. Change starts here with us. The room was silent for a moment before the chair of the board spoke. Thank you, Chief Brown. We'll deliberate and reconvene tomorrow. Jessica nodded, gathering her materials. As she left the room, she felt the weight of the moment pressing on her shoulders. This was the fight she had chosen, and she would see it through, no matter the cost. The following day, Jessica sat in her office awaiting the board's decision. Her phone buzzed, breaking the tense silence. It was Marcus Reed. "Chief," he said, his voice cautious. "The board's ready. They're calling a meeting." Jessica stood, smoothing her jacket and collecting her thoughts. She walked to the conference room with deliberate steps, the anticipation heavy in the air. When she entered, all eyes turned toward her. The chair of the board stood to address her. "Chief Brown," he began, his tone measured. "After thorough deliberation, the board has reached a unanimous decision. Officer Hayes will be suspended without pay, pending mandatory retraining, and will be reassigned to a probationary role upon completion. Furthermore, we have agreed to initiate an independent review of department-wide practices and oversight mechanisms to address systemic issues." Jessica allowed herself a small nod. It wasn't a perfect outcome, but it was a step forward, one she could build upon. The chair continued, "Your leadership in this matter has been commendable, Chief Brown. We appreciate your dedication to accountability and transparency." After the meeting, Jessica returned to her office. She gazed out the window at the bustling city below, her mind already turning to the next steps. The fight was far from over, but today had proven that progress was possible. For the first time in months, she allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She picked up the phone and dialed Marcus. "Let's get started on the review team," she said. "There's no time to waste." As the days turned into weeks, Jessica's efforts began to ripple through the department. Training sessions on implicit bias were rolled out, and officers were encouraged to engage with the communities they served. Public forums were organised to foster dialogue between law enforcement and residents, rebuilding trust one conversation at a time. While resistance persisted, Jessica's resolve never wavered. She knew the path to change was long and arduous, but with every step forward, she moved closer to creating a system that upheld justice for all.